In Washington, the House Intelligence Committee is expected to release a key report today. It's expected to show evidence against the president for potential articles of impeachment. Then tomorrow, the House Judiciary Committee will hold its first public hearings. Democrats will bring forward a number of legal scholars to help lay out the historical precedents for impeaching the president.
Now, the White House has until Friday to announce how the president plans to defend himself in the next phase of the inquiry. Chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us from Capitol Hill to talk about all this. So we were talking about this with Paul and Nancy. Do we have any idea, I guess, first off, what the report is going to say?
We have a pretty good idea. All you have to do is listen to Democrats over the last few weeks, and you get a pretty good sense of what this report is basically going to lay out. It's going to take 2 months worth of depositions and hearings and boil those all that testimony down into some key findings, such as the president, this report will argue, pressured the president of Ukraine to look into a campaign rival, and he dangled military aid and a coveted White House meeting as bait. And the findings will basically go through all the witness testimony and look for all the areas of agreement to try to create the underpinnings for a Democratic case for impeachment. The Republicans, as you know, kind of put out their own rebuttal. The Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee, 120 pages, basically arguing that there was no evidence that the president had pressured or bullied Ukraine, arguing, despite all the witness testimony, that what the president really cared about here was not an investigation of his campaign rival, but rather that he was very concerned about corruption in Ukraine and withheld military aid in an attempt to pressure the Ukrainian president to do more about it.
Yeah, you know, Nancy, it's really interesting, too. You're starting over the course of both the Russia investigation and now the investigation into what actually happened with regards to Ukraine. You've seen sort of the shifting narratives that the president and his supporters in Congress have embarked on. But now you're starting to hear from some Republican senators, including Senator Richard Burr. What did he have to say yesterday that sort of, I think, is raising a lot of eyebrows?
Right. I mean, he basically said if the president wants to say that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election, then he has every right to do that because the term meddle is very vague. And in Burr's view, there were a lot of Ukrainian leaders who openly disliked candidate Trump. They thought that he was too partial to their enemy, Russia, was not concerned about Russia's annexation of Crimea, and therefore they spoke out. And they made it clear that they would prefer his opponent, Hillary Clinton. In fact, Burr said almost all the leaders in Ukraine preferred Hillary Clinton, and therefore the president was right to be suspicious of Ukraine, and it's fine for him to say Ukraine meddled. The problem is that what we traditionally think of as election meddling is more along the lines of what Russia did when it systematically interfered in a covert way in the U.S. election, either via social media or by hacking Democratic emails and releasing them strategically via WikiLeaks to impose maximum damage on the Democratic nominee. So when you say Ukraine meddled and Russia meddled, it sure sounds like you're equating the two when they really don't belong in the same universe.
Right. I mean, I think that's the point that needs to be sort of highlighted and hammered home, which is that there were probably a lot of world leaders who did not want to see Donald Trump be elected president and probably went on the record and said so. There were a lot of Republicans, too, that didn't want to see Donald Trump elected and are now on that ship. Doesn't mean.
I mean, if that's your standard for meddling, then a lot of countries meddled in the 2016 election because there were world leaders from various countries who expressed a preference one way or another for one candidate or the other. But, you know, expressing a preference out in the open is a lot different from what the U.S. intelligence community says happened in Russia's case.
Yeah.
So before the release of the Intelligence Committee's report, the GOP sort of released their own report. And you talked about the number of different defenses that we've been hearing over time. They sort of kind of like poured that all into a report. And that's essentially what we got.
Right. And so what they're saying now is that despite all of this witness testimony from, I believe it was 17 different witnesses who testified both behind closed doors and then out in public, they really don't see enough evidence of bribery or any other high crime or misdemeanor. They say that the president had this legitimate concern about corruption in Ukraine. Despite the fact that he never raised it with the Ukrainian president, they now say that that's what was behind his decision to withhold military aid. And they say that all of these witnesses were basically relying on hearsay or their interpretation of what the president wanted, or second or third hand information to come to the conclusions that they came to, that the president was withholding this military aid because he wanted to put pressure on Ukraine. You do have to make a number of mental leaps to come to that conclusion, but nevertheless, that is the conclusion that they are coming to in this report, because the president has pushed Republicans to say not just that he maybe made a bad decision, but it's not impeachable, to leave that argument aside and to instead argue that he did absolutely nothing wrong in the first place. He repeated that mantra in London today.
All right. Nancy Cordes for us on Capitol Hill. Nancy, thank you very much.
You're welcome.